Hey, how's it going, everyone? Before we get started into this next episode, I want to give a quick shout out to a continued supporter of the podcast, being Seth Roy of North Mountain Goshawks. And if you're in the market for a new goshawk as a hunting partner for next upcoming season, particularly a parent-reared North American, Russian, or Finnish goshawk, you should definitely hit up Seth. He produces great birds, and everybody that I know that has flown one of the birds that he's produced has been very happy. So if you want to get on the list, hit him up at ostringer3@gmail.com, fill out the form at northmountaingoshawks.com, or send him a message at North Mountain Goshawks on Facebook and tell him we sent you. And now, on to this next episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast.
We flushed the pheasant, and it flew out to the west at sunset, and it was flying right into the sun, and all of a sudden the prairie falcon flew right through it, and there was just this big, dazzling explosion of feathers twinkling in the sun over the snow background. And it was pretty spectacular. Even my son got excited, and he was hard to get excited about falconry, but he still, we'll talk about that hit because it was so dramatic. There must have been a cloud of feathers about 20 feet in diameter in the air.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome back for another episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast. And this was another episode that I recorded last summer while I was heading up to Iowa to meet up and record with Ian Anderson and a few other folks. And this episode was actually recorded while I was making a detour to record with Lance Christensen as well. And Ross Dirks was kind enough to also be there that day and do a recording with me as well before I headed out to meet up with Ian later that day. But we talk about a lot of cool stuff in this episode, including his veterinary practice and some other things, flying long wings, all kinds of good stuff. So we'll just go ahead and turn things over like we always do and get into this conversation with Ross Dirks. Here we go. Lord knows we could banter all day about nothing. I know you got to get on the road eventually here and stuff.
But you got a long drive behind you and a little pretty significant chunk up you to go yet.
Oh yeah. What's another 3.5 to 4 hours after you've done 11 though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Your drive at least was 20 minutes to get here.
Yeah, probably 25 half hour, something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's at least it's not even 3 or 4 or 11. So. Yeah. But well, it's not nice to officially meet you, Ross. I know Ian's told me quite a bit about you and stuff, and I appreciate you and Lance being willing to set time aside a day to do this and talk with me for a little bit about all this fun, happy nonsense. And so you were coming down here to help him out anyway, right? With getting these birds shipped out and everything.
Yeah, I did the health inspection this morning, and right now we're kind of in the waiting process on that, but there's always something to do here too with the birds. It seems like every time I'm here, there's, one more thing.
Sure. Yeah. There's always one more thing, no matter what, it seems like, with everything. But, anyway, so out of curiosity, I know that this is another one of those topics that people may have heard some things about, but don't really know a whole lot about the process and stuff really. But like when it comes to getting these birds ready to be shipped, distributed, and, getting all the paperwork done and all that kind of stuff. I mean, go through that process if you don't mind a little bit, like kind of outline what all's involved with, I don't know if a lot of people realize how much is involved with getting these birds ready to go to their new owners and stuff.
Yeah. The international health papers are, they can be kind of a nightmare. It varies by country. It changes frequently. The Middle East is, the United Arab Emirates just changed theirs, where we've now got a 48-hour timetable to work with instead of a 7-day window from when I look at the birds to when they ship. So it's really tight. I have to do a veterinary exam, and then I fill out their health papers, and then there's the CITES import permits from their country. Lance receives CITES export permits so he can export out of here. These birds that are going today, we had to test for avian influenza. So I was here Monday, I think it was, and we swabbed their throats to check for avian influenza. And then because of the tight timetable, and the United Arab Emirates wants a stamped copy, not just a electronic copy, we have to send a overnight shipping label so that the USDA can overnight paperwork back to us, because we can't wait 2 days to receive the paperwork if we're shipping in 2 days. So it works on a tight timetable. Yeah. Some countries are easier. Canada has went to a 30-day inspection time, so my health certificate's good for 30 days. That just seems like a relief. It's very comparatively relaxed to be able to ship someplace like that.
Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to waiting for your head to explode, knowing that you got to redo all that paperwork again in 2 days if something falls through.
And especially, not this first shipment is just going to be 5 birds, but when we do the bigger shipments, there's a lot of people are bending their schedule around to come and help with that. And, we to all of a sudden call half a dozen people and say, hey, now we're going to go on next Tuesday instead of, this coming Friday, and just keep bumping it back. It causes a little bit of problem too.
I bet. Yeah. And not to mention the fact that if you've got to redo, these inspections and things like that, it's stressful for the birds and all that kind of stuff. And, not to mention stressful for you and for breeders like Lance and stuff too. But, yeah, it really is amazing how much goes into that stuff. And I've talked to some different people in different countries about, that have like CITES permits and do some international shipping and things. And it is interesting to see the differences in what different countries require and what they don't. Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I think there's just a lot of those kind of details a lot of people aren't aware of. So
yeah, no, it's definitely a stressful thing. So
yeah. Well, and so you've been a vet for how long?
Graduated from vet school in 1989.
So a while. Yeah. Did you decide to specialize in the avian side, or did you?
No, that would be, there's just a very, very limited number of jobs out there for an avian specialist. I was always interested in it. I grew up on a farm and, worked for vets in my hometown doing the large animal vet thing, going from one farm to the next, treating cattle and pigs. And, the small animal was just kind of a side gig for them. And, when I headed to college to, try to get into vet school, that's where I thought I would be going. And then as I got further into it, the large animal scheme of things was changing. I got more interested in the actual medicine. I was more, I got involved in falconry and some reptile stuff, and was getting more interested in exotics, and really thought about pursuing zoo medicine for a while. And I did some internships at a couple zoos. And then, life happened, and I was getting married and had a young family. And to get involved in that line of work, it really took somebody that either had major political connections to help them get placed in a job, or somebody who was willing to do, whatever work they could find, wherever they could get it, and do a lot of short-term stints and gather experience and pick up contacts along the way, and then eventually land a permanent position. And that doesn't suit very well if you're, family orientated.
For sure.
And then the other thing, that influenced that as I got more into falconry, I really didn't want to live in a large urban area, and all the zoos are generally going to be in large urban areas. So I ended up, going into small animal veterinary because that's more medicine orientated, and I could still do a little bit of birds and exotics in a private practice, but it was, mostly dogs and cats that I've made my living on.
Yeah, and I know like a lot of the other people that have wanted to go kind of more of the zoological, like they're the zoo vet type route and everything. There's all kinds of hurdles, and kind of some extra. I don't know, like obstacles in some of those regards, because I mean a lot of those zoos and stuff you're operating off of grants and things like that, and the income is different in some of those situations and things too. And I can understand, especially with a young family. I mean, also having the risk of needing to transplant and go to other places and stuff would be challenging. So I get it.
Yeah, and a lot of those paid little or nothing.
Yeah.
I did work on one wildlife study that I got good pay on. It was, studying a effect of a chemical on birds of prey, and they needed somebody on short notice that already knew raptors and knew how to handle raptors and could trap raptors, and had at least a bachelor's degree and could show up in South Texas in 3 weeks. That limited their job pool, and I was able to get that job. But that was a rarity to have something that actually paid well. I remember there was one position I applied for. I think it was with the Peregrine Fund or an organization associated with it. And I'd applied, and I was kind of waiting to hear back. And I hadn't heard anything. And I was starting to, it was a summer internship, and I need to find out. So I called, and they says, well, if you haven't heard anything, you didn't get the position. He said, we had over 2,000 applications for these 6 positions, and it was not paid. So you had 2,000 people, that had the same interest that I were, that were willing to volunteer an entire summer and not get paid. To me, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And I wasn't in the economic bracket where I could really afford a summer of not getting paid.
Who can, for the most part, with the exception of a very few type of people, that's funny though. I mean, it just shows you how narrow and competitive that particular avenue for that field is, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard from multiple people that those jobs are very hard to get, and when you do get them, like you're describing, you're not going to get paid very much. So, yeah. But I don't know. There are certain species and certain animals, though, that you have to go through certain routes and avenues to get experience with. So, I mean, on one hand, I understand, but at the other, I don't fall into the category of being able to give a whole summer and not make any money. So,
yeah.
But in regards to your own, falconry and getting into it, though, I mean, so you were a little bit older then whenever you kind of got into it, or?
I was in college. I had an interest in it when I was young. I remember reading an article in one of the sports outdoor magazines. It was Sports Afield or Field and Stream. And there was an article about falconry in there, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. I probably read it when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, and read it. I didn't get that it was, in my mind, it was something that people did somewhere else. It sounded really cool, like hunting Cape buffalo in Africa or scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef. But I didn't get that was actually something I could do right there in Iowa where I grew up. So it seemed like a faraway thing. And then when I got down to college, one of my friends met a falconer, and I started, latched onto the guy like a parasite. And, went hawking with him quite a bit. He showed me how to make hoods and helped me make equipment, and eventually sponsored me and, got me started. This was Joe Zawodowski, who was, back in the day, a pretty prominent Illinois falconer that had moved to Iowa. And I learned a lot from him and got started. But about the time that I got licensed, he got a job where he was going to move to North Carolina and work at Duke. So I was pretty much on my own again at first, and then I had to kind of find my way. I found some falconers in Minnesota that were active that I could tag along with and learn from. John Arndt and Ben Olander come to mind as some mentors that I had. And Joe's friend John Wilde became a good mentor to me. So, I met some falconers along the way that really helped me out.
Yeah, so you were subjected to John at a semi-early age, and that was, I bet you that was interesting.
Yeah, I actually, I volunteered up at the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota and lived with, stayed at John's house for a couple weeks. So it's definitely an interesting experience. The The guy is into it, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, I always like giving John a hard time. But yeah, no, it's funny. There's so many people. With it being such a small community and so niche and everything, it doesn't take long before you start kind of getting out a little bit more and getting around more and more people that you start finding that a lot of paths start to intersect. So that's cool. Yeah, I don't know. At this point, like there's still a lot of people that I haven't met and stuff and know by name. But yeah, no, it's been interesting discovering, how small of a world it is for sure. Whenever you got into a lot of this, what was your initial early exposure to a lot of, was it mainly just that handful of people that initially helped you, or did you get out and go to meets and try and meet a bunch of new people and stuff in other areas? Or
at that time, the Iowa Falconers Club was just forming, and it formed while I was in college. I don't remember exactly the timetable, but it was very new and not very organized. It seemed like if I wanted to see more and more people that were being successful, I ended up driving to Minnesota, which, I didn't have a lot of money when I was young. So just like a road trip up to Mankato, was a significant expense for me. But I went up to a few Minnesota falconry meets and got to meet and watch people there that were really doing it. It was before I'd met Lance and some of the other Iowa falconers that I, learned from later, and we started out roughly the same time, but I was not in the same area, not in the same group necessarily. So I didn't mix with them as much, but, the Iowa club there wasn't much there for me, I guess. So I'd go up to Minnesota, and then I just did a lot of stuff on my own and, read books, and my sponsor gave me a whole stack of old hawk chalks to read. And he told me before he left. So I got my first red tail like right before he left the state. And he says, well, if you can catch 10 rabbits in your first year, you're doing pretty good. And I caught 29, and I thought I was God's gift to falconry. I was pretty impressed that I tripled the number of rabbits he thought I might catch,
Yeah.
So he said, for your first hawk and its first year of hunting, so it was a journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny how it doesn't matter who you talk to. It seems like there's a continual running theme. It's very hard to find especially if they've had early success, it's hard to find a humble, like second year apprentice or first year general.
Yeah.
Did you, whenever you became a general and kind of, started evolving a little bit, did you kind of go through some of the same, I don't know, like I don't even want to call them growing pains, but some of the early temptations and things that a lot of people kind of succumb to, where you want to just fly everything and do all this different stuff, or were you pretty focused?
It was partly as focused. My first bird I had as a general was another passage red tail. So I flew 3 passage red tails. And then I had an opportunity to get a goshawk in my 4th year. And things were different then. You couldn't just call breeders and get birds. And say, hi, I see you're breeding peregrines. I'd like a peregrine. How much? And write a check and get the bird. That you really had to have references. And if you weren't well known, you weren't, nobody would sell you a bird. So, and the take from the wild was really limited. To find some place where you could get a goshawk was pretty intimidating again to somebody who didn't have a lot of money. So I got this goshawk that had been to a wildlife rehabilitator. The story behind it was somebody called the DNR one day and said, how do I get a falconry license for a goshawk? And they told him, well, you can't just get a falconry license for a goshawk. You have to go through this long process of being an apprentice. And 2 days later, this little tiny fuzzball of a goshawk showed up at a wildlife rehabilitator with the story that he'd found it on the ground while fishing in Minnesota and brought it home with him, not knowing that it was illegal. Well, that's pretty fishy, but the rehabilitator really didn't have a lot of experience with such things. Raised the goshawk in her house, imprinting it totally, being around her and her kids and her dogs. And when she took it up to the University of Minnesota so they could release it, Dr. Reddig looked at it and said, this bird isn't releasable. I mean, it waddled around, food baking at his feet.
Yeah.
And Kay Newman, that had drove it up there, said, well, I know a falconer who might like to try it because he's always wanted to fly a goshawk. So it ended up in my hands, and it was really a pretty good bird. I caught both pheasants and rabbits with it, and had a lot of fun with it, and eventually lost it.
Yeah. How did that happen?
I had one telemetry transmitter, and the day before, and I started out without telemetry. Again, telemetry was new back in 1984 also. So, I splurged and bought, the old MN10, or no, it was the receiver was the Wildlife Materials, the blue box that you had a separate cable and an antenna.
I gotcha. Yeah.
And the first in the line of the Luxander receivers, the LF1.
Yeah.
And anyway, he'd been chasing quail. I was living in Oregon at the time and lost the transmitter at a big blackberry panel or tangle. And the next day I was supposed to go hawking with a friend that knew some good rabbit spots in Portland. And I hadn't been able to find the transmitter and went hawking anyway. And the rabbit hawking spot that he took me to was right next to an airport. A jet went by and the hawk bolted, never to be seen again.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah.
So, I learned that telemetry was worth it.
Yeah.
Even if it was expensive.
Well, and the reason I ask is because, everybody can learn from other people's, like even whether it's our fault or not, everybody can always learn from other people's like unfortunate events, so to speak, yeah, it's always a bummer.
Yeah, life's too short to make all the mistakes on your own.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I mean, there's some people I think that learn that quicker than others, unfortunately. But yeah, well, cool. And so, I mean, at what point in time then? I mean, did you ever, because of your veterinary practice and stuff, did you ever have to take any time off from falconry, or did you ever have any kind of issues with finding time to pursue it or anything? Or
finding time was always difficult. My second job out of school, I was working for a practice. The guy that owned it was very demanding, and I had a red tail, but I was only able to fly it on weekends, and a lot of times only on Sundays because I was working 6 and 7 days a week, and Sunday was really the only day I typically had any time. So that didn't work very well. That job we were there for like 2 weeks, and we quit unpacking boxes because I knew it wasn't going to last. Not just because of the falconry end of it. And then the next job I went to, the guy was a lot more accommodating, and I could hawk on my lunch hour most days. So we shut the practice down for about 2 hours over lunch. I was able to, say, well, I'll stay late and catch up on stuff that I might have done over, the extra hour of lunch, and, get things done. But I really like to have a good chunk of time where I could get out and fly my hawk. And he was very accommodating with that. And then after that, I bought my own practice, and it's in a resort community up around the Iowa Great Lakes. And there, things really slow down in the winter. Summers are incredibly busy, but in wintertime, I was back to being able to hawk on my lunch hour a lot of days. So I would take a 2-hour lunch and hawk on the lunch hour. So basically, I was able to work my schedule to get falconry in. Sometimes I wasn't able to get out on a lunch hour because something came up. And if a dog got hit by a car, it's not like I was going to say, oh, well, it's time for me to go hawking.
Yeah.
So
sure that'd go over well.
And I, like most falconers, I pushed my relationship. I'm still married after 36 years, but there were times where my wife was like, yeah, this isn't working so good.
Yeah, there's a reason why the divorce rate is so high in our little community. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, trials and tribulations, as they always say, trials and tribulations. There's never, seems like there's never a year that goes by without some kind of new challenge in that regard. Yeah. And there's been some instances that I've really had to, I mean, it didn't even take my wife's always been pretty accommodating for the most part. She doesn't care about any of it, like we were talking about before, but like she knows that it's something I like to do, so she tolerates it. The times that I can remember, there's a couple times where I was just like, I actually had to check myself. Like, it didn't even come from her. I was just like, this is starting to get a little too, you kind of catch yourself, a little bit. And
I have to do that a lot. It's real easy for me, caught up and carried away in things, and it's just kind of my personality that I pretty gung ho when I'm going, and I have to take a little check every now and then. And we did have a discussion one time, when she was upset about how I was prioritizing, and I'm like, well, it's not that, the bird is more important, but, say if the bird's out lost right now, it's more important that I find that bird than I get home on time to, go to church with you. I says that doesn't mean it's more important, but it's more urgent, and that has to take priority for this minute. Overall, is in the big picture, no, that's not more important. But I can't. I says, I compared it like having to pee. It's not the most important thing in my life, but when it's urgent, it's got to get taken care of. And some of these things are just, there's a time where you just have to take care of it. And sometimes the bird has to bump up to the top of the priority list because of the situation. But overall, I, truly believe you need to have it lower on your list than family and work.
Yeah. And the problem though is that unfortunately, a lot of the times that it becomes more urgent or at the most inconvenient and inopportune times, like ever.
Oh yeah. There'd be no drama if it wasn't that
way. It's not ever like, well, the bird's going to casually just kind of screw off and get lost for a little while on just a pleasant Saturday morning when nothing else is going on, no families coming into town for a holiday or, this, that, or the other, stuff like that. It's, it's going to be that we still decide to go ahead and fly a bird on an occasion in which we know that we have time sensitive, like nature's involved, but we still do it anyway. And that's the day that the bird's going to decide to go to Mexico and ruin our life for a day.
Yeah. Or, something, a bald eagle comes in and chases it out of sight.
Yeah. There's always going to be something. And so what I started doing is I started adopting a policy. I had to start because there was a couple instances in which that happened to me, I know. And there was a couple of times where I really had to be like, okay, you're going to have to adopt this policy for yourself, that if there is something time sensitive or some kind of family thing going on, or this particular thing's going on, like you're gonna have to make yourself not fly that day, because inevitably, Murphy's Law, how it goes. And that happened to me a couple of different times. So now I have a no fly policy on certain days, and it's hard sometimes, but in the end, it's not really worth the drama, really, honestly.
Right. And early in my career, I thought it was very important that I fly my bird every day and not miss days. And I think it's very important that you fly them regularly. Once a week isn't enough, but missing a day here and there isn't the end of the world, that you can miss a day. And especially as I've gotten flying two birds, a lot of times, I will fly one day and one the next and alternate them back and forth, a lot of the time. And then on days where I do have more time, maybe I can get them both flown. But I have more of a tendency to, like, if they get a kill, I feed them a great big crop and give them a day off just so that I can focus on something else the next day and not have falconry on my plate at all.
Sure. Yeah. It's, like I said, it's always a struggle. It's just that the angel and the demon on each shoulder, telling you to do one versus the other. And we all. I think that most falconers, it's kind of a prerequisite. You kind of have to have an addictive personality to some degree to and struggle with it constantly as well. But
yeah, there just isn't enough reward in it to make it truly worthwhile. But for some reason, I'm motivated by that. This is going to be the day where it's just perfect and everything works good. And then, it makes all those other days where things weren't so good well worth it.
Yeah, it's chasing the dragon, so to speak, man. Yeah, yeah, and everybody remembers the first high and stuff, and then you're always seeking that forevermore afterwards, so to speak. And yeah, it's a constant struggle in that regard. But as far as like kind of going back to, as far as your veterinary practice, even though like you didn't like specialize in avian medicine, so to speak, how regularly were you seeing birds and seeing issues with birds?
Not when I was in Davenport. Bird practice was a much bigger part of it. So I was there for 8.5 years, and I did work for 2 small zoos while I was, working in a private practice there. And probably somewhere around 20% of what I did was bird and exotic work. So there it was a fairly major part. Up here at Spirit Lake, it was tiny. There just, it was a rural area. There weren't many people that owned birds. Most of them that did, would have never thought about taking their bird to a vet. It was kind of a disposable thing. I did, work for, falconers around the state and around the area. A lot of Minnesota falconers would bring birds down to me, and some people from South Dakota and Nebraska would come over. But that was very hit and miss. It wasn't like I was doing that every week, or even on any kind of regular basis. I'd see a few falconer birds around the area. I did a lot of work for a couple different wildlife rehabilitators, so injured hawks, wild eagles. At the time, a big part of the early time in my practice up in Spirit Lake, they were releasing trumpeter swans, and the wildlife rehabilitator up there and I were the place where the state would bring trumpeter swans that were injured anywhere in the state. So I got to deal with a lot of trumpeter swans. And then, I was working with Lance all along too. Before I moved up here partly because Lance Christensen was in the area and we'd gotten to be pretty good friends. And I knew the hunting was really good up here. And I had the opportunity to, buy a practice in Spirit Lake. So, I'd moved up here. And then as Lance's breeding operation grew, I did more and more work with his birds. And probably, over the years, by, well over half of the raptors I've ever worked on were, Lance's birds, just because of the volume of his project.
Gotcha. Yeah. So each time that you ended up buying a practice or whatever, were you, was it pretty much just you in the practice, or did you end up bringing anybody else to?
The practice, the other practices I was working for somebody when I bought the practice in Spirit Lake, that was mine. So I worked the first few years alone, and then I hired an associate that was there for, I think, 8 years. Went a couple years without, hired another associate who didn't work out very well that was there for less than a year. And after getting close to 20 years in the practice, I hired another associate that was interested in buying the practice from me. So we worked together for a couple years, and then he ended up buying the practice. I stayed on and worked on a decreasing basis over the next 5 years, and I just retired this last January.
Well, cool. Yeah, no, it's I like hearing how people kind of progress through their. I've had the ability to talk to, I don't know, at least probably anywhere between like 4 to a half a dozen different vets now and stuff. And everybody's kind of paths through their veterinary practice and how they get to where they're going seems to be a little different. It's interesting hearing about how, especially like some of these vets from other countries, sometimes they come over and do, different, like, I don't know if you call them residencies or whatever, but, study over here and or other countries. And, hearing about, that kind of stuff is always neat. I mean, you pretty much have always practiced here in the U.S., though. You've never really done anything in any other countries or anything.
No,
like that.
And I haven't traveled really all that much either. That, I was pretty tied down to my work, the first years when I was working for other people, it was not customary for vets to be able to get much vacation time from their jobs. So I didn't get much vacation time, so we didn't really go anywhere. So I'm very limited in traveling. I've never went to a country that I couldn't drive across the border to get to. So I've flown into different parts of Mexico a few times, but at one point I lived down close to the border and would cross the border regularly, but I've never been to a foreign country that doesn't border the United States. So I would like to travel more now that I'm retired, but it hasn't worked out yet.
So are you going to continue to maintain your license and everything during your retirement, or?
At least for a while.
Yeah.
Part of it is I still, like working with Lance and working with his birds, and I have to have a license and be accredited and all that to be able to do that. So as long as he needs me, I'll continue to have a license. And it lets me, friends around the country that need help, I can help them, and around the state, and my brother-in-laws and different friends of mine with dogs I can take care of, but I don't really have any plans to get back into practice.
Okay. Well, and one other question I want to ask pertaining to that before we switch topics a little bit. I mean, whenever I do talk to vets, I do like to ask them, like, what in their opinion, as far as relates to raptors especially, I mean, what seems to be the most common issue, and like one of the most severe issues, I should say, or one or the other, when it comes to dealing with raptors that you see on a consistent basis?
Unfortunately, I think the biggest thing is people over using weight control, that they get it in their head that, they're training a bird and this is its response weight, and they don't realize that response weight is a fluid thing, that it isn't, my bird, when I was flying it to the lure, when it was first got it, I had it at 850 grams, and therefore 850 grams is its response weight, and that's where I'm going to keep it from now on. And then they get to winter, and that's not enough. They need to increase that. And then in the spring, you're probably going to have to decrease it again as the weather warms up. And the other thing is keeping them hydrated, that a lot of people forget about water in the winter when everything's frozen. And, birds in the winter that are low in condition, they aren't getting enough food, they're thin, they're a little bit dehydrated. That's where things like sauerkraut and midwinter anemia sneak in and kill birds. And unfortunately, that's all too common.
Yeah, that's why I like to ask, because and it's especially common. From what I've seen anyway, it's an especially common mistake with your early, apprentice, falconers and stuff that still are grasping the whole concept of weight management and everything like that. And I mean, it's a mistake it's really common, and it's especially like for first year apprentices and things, and they get it in their head like their bird's flying at this particular weight, like you were saying, and then all of a sudden the temp drops about 40 degrees and they're still, I mean, I made the same mistake too. I mean, I caught it before it became an issue, but all of a sudden your bird's weak and you don't understand why, and
that
kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I try to, for my apprentices, I say there's a big difference between starving and being hungry. I said, I'm hungry at least 3 times a day. Mm. I'm not even close to starving ever. That I could easily afford to miss a few meals, but when it's time, I feel it, even though I'm not really, I shouldn't be hungry, but when it's time to go. So your hawk, if you're on, hawking on a schedule, if you've got it close to weight, it should be ready to go. It shouldn't have to feel like it's starving to death to want to chase a rabbit or a pheasant.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I mean, there's, hopefully people can learn and catch it before it, becomes a big issue. But unfortunately, it's a lesson that some people have to learn the hard way. Unfortunately, it's just, it is what it is. But no, I'm like I said, I appreciate, like I said, that I'm always curious to see what people encounter the most in their practices, and like I said, everybody has different issues with certain things, more like depending on certain areas that they live in and things like that. I realize that too, but I mean, I know there's always like more common things than others. So, But
West Nile virus has been a big problem since it's come around, and that definitely affects a lot of birds.
yeah. Well, didn't you do or did you do any extra like research about that? Early on?
I was I was the first one that had any real research into it. Pat Reddig, co-sponsored a paper with me on it, but I did like the initial research, mostly for Lance. Was right when he was getting into the breeding the Russian Goshawks, and there were a couple white Goshawks that got it and died, and it's like, we can't have this. So, I knowing what I did about vaccines, I'm like, well, we should be able to use a vaccine that's already out there for horses and try to figure out how to use it for birds. And with this Kay Newman that has a charity called SOAR, Save Our Avian Resources, she had several long-term cripple birds that we were able to give the vaccine. I think we vaccinated 17 birds, and I drew blood ahead of time, and then we gave them the series of 2 shots, and then drew blood afterwards to see if that caused their antibodies to go up. We did it during the winter when there would be no mosquitoes, where there would be any risk of natural exposure, and most of the birds had a measurable antibody response. So then, and we had no bad reactions. So the next year we started vaccinating hawks, and it definitely helped.
Yeah. Is that something that you would recommend pretty much most people do? I mean, is it like kind of just a general practice, or do you think should be more of on a bird by bird type of basis, you think?
I think if, a lot of it comes down to the mosquitoes. If you're in an area where there's a mosquito problem, I would recommend vaccinating the bird. If you're in Southwest Arizona and you never see a mosquito, why bother?
Sure. Yeah. I get it. I've had people tell me before, it's just like, well, it's also kind of depending on, well, it's like, yeah, if you buy like a $5,000 whatever, then sure, I'm probably going to be more likely to vaccinate that bird as opposed to say like a passage red tail that I just trap for a season or whatever and stuff too. But I mean, I don't know, what's a vaccine like that run nowadays? Do you know off the top of your head?
I believe my cost is about $25 a dose, and that would be for a horse dose. And we vaccinated the birds of prey with half a dose and doing it twice, 2 weeks apart. And then after that, once a year. So
it's not that expensive.
It's not that terribly expensive. Okay. If you were having to go to a vet and have them give you administer the vaccine, and if you only had one bird to vaccinate, that meant half of the vaccine was going to go to waste. I look at it that, if the bird's important to you, and the hawk I'm flying is very important to me, it doesn't matter if it's a red tail or what. But one thing with that passage red tail is it's probably already survived it or not.
That's a good
if
point.
It's been in the wild and sitting in a nest, and
that's a good point, sitting
out where red tails live in a mosquito prone area, it probably was exposed before you trapped it in October. So I think, I would worry less about that, not because the bird didn't cost as much, but because chances are it's already been exposed.
And already has antibodies and stuff.
Yeah, already has antibodies.
Yeah. I gotcha. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. I mean, that's one of those kind of almost common sense outlook kind of things about it, more so than, like you said, the cost and or difficulty to acquire type of thing. But yeah, no, I mean, I like I said, I didn't realize the vaccine for that was that cheap. I thought it was more expensive than that. So,
yeah. And it would be if you want, that's the cost that I, as a veterinarian, can order it from a wholesale distributor. So that's going to, go up considerably as somebody buys it, and then, especially if they're going to administer it for you, and
sure,
you have to pay an office visit and an exam, and then for the shot, I'm probably going to run up to $100 pretty quickly in a lot of practices.
Sure.
And a lot of the places that would be able to, would vaccinate birds, there aren't many that deal with raptors. It's not something you'd vaccinate your parrot for. Yeah. So your typical bird vet isn't going to have any on the shelf. And then you got to try to find an equine vet that's willing to vaccinate your hawk. It's not as easy as it would be nice if it was.
Yeah. Well, and moving on a little bit then, and do you like still flying both long wings and goshawks and stuff, or are you pretty much focused on one type of species nowadays?
I like flying both. If I have a long wing, I miss going out in the woods and chasing rabbits. And if I've got a hawk, whether it's a goshawk or a red tail, I miss seeing that stoop, especially give me a crystal clear winter day when there's, a new snow on the ground. I want to be out there chasing pheasants with a long wing on those days. So, as I've had time, I usually have tried to have one of each, but I haven't always had time. So sometimes I, am flying one or the other by, what was available when I needed a bird. And, I had my last goshawk, I flew it 11 seasons, and most of that time it was my only bird. I didn't have time to fly more than one because it was, the last years I was owning the practice and my life was, pretty focused on keeping the veterinary practice going. A lot of times running a practice that was big enough to support 2.5 to 3 veterinarians and doing it all by myself, and having an experienced hawk that I could just grab out of the mews and go out and kill something with was pretty nice. And having a second bird, there was no time for such a thing. Now, I'm hoping to kind of stick with being able to fly a goshawk and a falcon and, do them in, tandem or rotation.
And with the falcons, I mean, are you primarily hunting, was it pheasants?
Pheasants are my main quarry here. We live in a real good pheasant area. I've also hawked ducks quite a bit, and I've got some good winter duck spots. But the last few years with the avian influenza, I've avoided ducks and just concentrated on pheasants with the long wings and huns. We've got some huns around, and and it seems like the last couple of years we had more. I'm concerned we've had some record flooding in our area now, and I suspect that's going to be very bad for our game bird numbers.
I can see that. And I mean, honestly, though, I can see if you've got some of these other types of quarry that you can fly that might be, especially in some instances, possibly like a little bit more challenging. I can see why you'd want to kind of steer away more from the ducks and focus more on, like the pheasants and huns and stuff. Also, I mean, I don't have much of a frame of reference. Obviously where I'm at, long wings pretty, like hunting with a long wing is pretty limited. So I've only really gotten to see duck hawking and snipe hawking with long wings in person. So, I don't really have much of a frame of reference when it comes to pheasant and huns versus, difficulty versus, with like ducks and other quarry and stuff. So
yeah, and ducks depend a lot on the setup. I see a lot of people say, ducks are so easy. And as I'm driving across, South Dakota or Nebraska, and I see all these little tiny postage stamp sized ponds, where you've got a stock dam and, a double garage size piece of water, and you can walk up behind the stock dam and pop up over the dam and flush the ducks off the little pond. That looks really easy. Like one of the places I fly in the winter typically has hundreds, if not thousands, of mallards packed on it. It's a warm water area, and everything else is frozen up, and that takes a different. The bird has to learn how to deal with those numbers and single out an individual, and it's not as easy as hawking lone ducks off small water. And it's definitely different from pheasant hawking, but I don't really think it's any easier.
And what about like huns? And do you think
huns? The hard thing with them is finding them. In my mind, there's people that are absolute hun nuts and hun specialists. I like them, but I don't drive past a pheasant setup to fly huns. I don't keep looking. Once I see quarry, and by far we've got more pheasants up here, so Rob Kirkman is an awesome hunt hawker, and if he's up here and he spends a fair amount of time up here, we go out and we look for hunts and we'll drive for hours, and that's just not something I'm going to do on my own. Even now that I'm retired, I don't feel like I've got the time to go out and half an hour of driving around. I'm getting antsy and I'm ready to just jump out and run the dog down the ditch and see if I can find a pheasant.
Yeah, fair enough. I know it. The ideal quarry is always in the eye of the beholder, and honestly, I mean, the ideal quarry is also what you have the most of. So I understand why you tend to lean more towards pheasant in that regard. But yeah, so you hunt with dogs also? Yeah. And what breed of dogs do you?
A poodle pointer right now.
Oh yeah. How's that?
She's been good. I got her, and then I got the original one from Tom Deckert, who's a falconer, and he was breeding poodle pointers at the time. And then I've got a puppy from her also. And I've had mostly German short hairs over the years, but and I've also got a long-haired dachshund that I inherited. One of my falconry apprentices had it, and he passed away. He had cancer, and I ended up inheriting Stanley from him. And it's been a blast hunting rabbits with that little dachshund and the goshawk. So,
yeah, that's become a obvious bias of mine as well. So I've got 3 of them in the truck right now. So, it's hard to beat just pure fun in chasing bunnies. It's hard to beat as far as just the fun of watching dogs work. Seeing dachshunds working bunnies. It's pretty entertaining.
Yeah,
but
it's pretty cool once that hawk figures out what's going on, and that dog, heads into a brush pile and starts yipping. The hawk is right there overhead, waiting for the rabbit to come out. And it can be one of those situations that you almost don't want to bring somebody who's never seen falconry along to see, because it just looks too easy.
Yeah. It can be, it can definitely offer a skewed perspective. Yeah. That's for sure. But I mean, going back to the whole poodle pointer thing though, I mean, like I think I've only ever talked to 1 or 2 people that have used poodles for hunting in falconry.
Yeah. The poodle pointer is a German breed that's older. They've been around, I think, for like 180 years now. So it's not like a labradoodle or a golden doodle that's a new thing where we're just crossing a poodle with a pointer. Mm-hmm. It's a breed that was developed using the German pudel, Pudel, instead of the French poodle.
Ah, okay.
And it's basic. The poodle pointer people won't like to hear this, but to me, they're just another German hunting dog. They're like a German short hair or German wire hair, or a Griffon, or and I know Griffons aren't German, but any of those versatile breeds, they're more alike than they are different in my mind. They might have some little differences, but you use them all the same. They do the same, fit the same niche. So it's much like having a German wire hair. Mine are slick. They don't have the wiry coat like most poodle pointers, and that works better for me in all the places I hunt with lots of burrs if I'm using them for rabbits. Now that I've got the dachshund, I tend to use them for, the pointing dogs for pheasants more and less for rabbits. But for a long time, they served double duty, and we're doing rabbits and pheasants. So
that makes sense. Yeah, so that's another breed that I don't have much familiarity with. So I'm becoming a little bit more indoctrinated into the dog world. Over the last 2-3 years, especially. It's been another nice byproduct of doing these podcasts and stuff too, is learning more about some of these different dog breeds. So that's cool. And as far as how old's the dachshund that you have?
I think he is about 10 years old now. I didn't get papers with him when I got him, so he'd had him. I think he was roughly 6 years old when I got him, and I think it's 3 to 4 years now that I've had him.
Okay. Well, and so you said primarily rabbits with the goshawk, though?
I've done quite a few pheasants over the years. And it just depends. One thing I like about the goshawk is the versatility. We get a lot of real windy days up here, 30, 40 mile an hour winds. And it's just not very feasible to be out hawking pheasants in the open, with a goshawk in that kind of wind. Walking with a hawk on the fist, wind over 20 miles an hour gets to be challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And, trying to fly in those kind of windy conditions just doesn't work very well. But I can go to a wooded area, turn the hawk loose and have it follow me through the trees and hunt rabbits all day without any issue. And I've done that. With that last goshawk I had, sometimes I was hunting in winds that were gusting up to 50 miles an hour. And, by being within the woods and the trees where the chase part of it was going to be sheltered, she'd stay right with me. And even hunting like strip cover, like in an overgrown fence line, she'd follow me as I walked down the fence line into the wind and watch and be able to, chase and catch rabbits even in a really high wind.
And I'm assuming this goshawk was a parent reared,
which, being, really good friends with Lance and doing all his vet work for years, it typically was in a situation where if I wanted to get a new hawk, all I had to do is quit saying no.
I figured there had to be a perk in there somewhere.
Yeah, so typically, there'd be multiple times in a season if he thought I might want a hawk where he'd have some bird that he offered me. Sometimes it was a bird that he wanted flown for the breeding project where I would fly it for a season or two and kind of fly it with kid gloves. I wasn't treating it like my own falconry bird. A lot of times it was the second bird on the string, and I flew it during good conditions and didn't take any risks. Not that I try to be real risky with my own bird, but, I minimized risk taking with it and would fly it. Sometimes it was a bird that might not be able to be sold because of a problem. I had one, was a gyr, 3/4 gyr, 1/4 peregrine hybrid that had sat with its tail hanging in the bath pan, and the veins got eaten off its feathers. Its feathers were just sticks coming down before Lance realized what was happening. Well, you couldn't sell that bird like that. You couldn't really imp its entire tail and then sell it. So, he gave it to me. I imped the entire tail and, flew it. So, a couple times there were people that would have birds that they either got from him or for whatever reason gave to him that he really didn't want for the breeding project. And, some of those birds I got and flew. Some of them have been problem birds. And as I've been in falconry a long time, I've, developed a pretty good reputation for being able to work with some of those birds. So I also get falconers not coming through Lance that will call me up and say, hey, I've got this bird and it's just not working out for me. This and this is what's going on. And would you want it? I just can't seem to get anything done with it. And depending on the situation, I might just take a bird like that too. And, I find it, I like the challenge of working with something and see if I can work through the behavioral issues. Now, some behavioral issues I no longer have much interest in trying to work through.
Well, I was just going to say, I guess it probably depended on your emotional state at the time too, and how much self-loathing you were going through to want to try and work through some of that stuff also. I don't know. It doesn't seem like a idea of a good time for me, but I know like there's a lot of people that do like that challenge.
Yeah. And a lot of it would be just the situation. If I'd had a bird and, something happened, it hit a wire and broke its, got killed, had to be euthanized for whatever reason. And it's the middle of winter and I don't have a bird and somebody's got a bird that I can take. It seems better than no bird.
Well, I was going to say at that point, it's either facing your season being just a wash anyway, or, you can try and work through something else. At least you're learning something that way.
Yeah.
Getting some more experience and stuff.
Yeah. And some of them came around and did really well. Some of them not as well. But, generally I've worked, almost all of them had made improvement. I can think of one that didn't. And that one surprised me because it came from somebody who I really respect as a falconer. I think he's a really good falconer. He said the bird had been flying good and I got it. And it did nothing but fly off and sit.
Yeah, there's been some instances where I've seen things like that as well, and I know one of the early mistakes I made with some previous birds too was, or one previous bird in particular was, going by what someone else's weight, they told you what they were flying, the bird at and stuff, and that is a mistake that I haven't ever made sense either. Yeah. You can only go by that kind of thing so much. Just take it as a grain of salt, in a lot of instances and stuff too. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, some people just love that extra challenge. I know for me, I'm not at a point in my life yet where I have a lot of extra, like time or circumstances right now to like really work through problem birds. But anyway.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it is that I just feel sorry for the bird, that I think that whatever the situation, it didn't get a fair chance. Sometimes it was, situations with the falconer's life that they didn't have time for it. Sometimes things just happened that screwed the bird up that were outside of everybody's control. And I hate to see a bird like that just shuffled around and, end up never seeing its potential.
Yeah, I can see that too. And, once again, I mean, good on you for having that outlook. There's all kinds of situations, unfortunately, where, I think that people don't realize that, especially like certain species are much more of a time suck than others. And, some circumstances, I mean, yeah, every species needs to be flown as much as possible, but there's some, it seems like that if you don't do this particular amount at a minimum, like you're going to run into problems more so than others and everything too.
Yeah, red tails are a great beginner bird because they are so forgiving. That doesn't mean I think that you should only, appreciate them as beginners, but yeah, you can do a lot of stuff with a red tail and still have it hunt good that, would melt a goshawk down.
Exactly. Yep. Case in point. But, yeah. So, well, I mean, and do you see, for as long as you continue to practice falconry, do you see yourself primarily continuing to mainly just fly those two species? Is there anything else that you want to try that you haven't? Or
I've got several. I've flown 2 Merlins. I've never was wildly successful with either one, but the micro falconry does interest me. And maybe now that I've got more time, it's really hard here where we get harsh winters here. It will get some weather where daytime highs do not, get up into the, single digits below zero. It stays 10 below zero even during the day. So, the microhawks don't handle that, but, I've thought about, flying those. I'd like to try a Sharpie sometime. I think it would have to be just like an early season hawk for me, that I wouldn't be able to fly something like that through the winter. And I would either, fly it and then hack it loose again later in the fall when it was time for it to get south, or have to, put it away and keep it till it warmed up again. I've never flown a kestrel, and I think that would be fun. Obviously they're abundant, they've been available, but I am biased towards the game hawking, that I want to hunt something that I see as game. Now I know, the kestrel sees those sparrows as game, and the same with the Sharpie and the Merlin, but it's harder for me a lot of times to find a sparrow or a starling slip than it is a pheasant slip.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Normally it's counterintuitive whenever you think about it in a lot of areas, but having driven through here and seeing this area, like I can understand why that would be the case. There's a lot of swaths of areas through here where it's just nothing but fields, and unfortunately, like a lot of your best starling slips and sparrow slips and things like that are more urban, type settings in a lot of ways.
And we're short on urban, which I really like.
Yeah. So it's not very often that you would think that would be the case. It seems counterintuitive to most people, but I can understand, having driven through here now, why that would be the case.
Yeah. That was with the second Merlin I had. The first one I had when I lived out in Oregon. The second one I trapped up here, and trying to, I could fly it around farms where you were in amongst buildings and there would be a lot of sparrows around, or starlings around and sparrows, but you'd never get to see anything. It'd fly around the corner of the building and be gone. And then you're basically flipping on the telemetry right away. This was pre-GPS. And, I spent more time looking for the bird than watching flights. My first Merlin, I was, hawking sparrows around the yard, and I'd actually would kind of just leave it out, and it would chase sparrows into a brush pile or something. And then I'd be messing around doing something else. And then I'd go chase some sparrows out of a brush pile somewhere else. And it took off on me one time, I think just drifted off and ended up getting killed by a red tail. But the places where you could actually go out and find little birds like that, where you could sit and watch the flight, are few and far between. In the winter, we have, snowbirds come down, snow buntings, longspurs, horned larks in big flocks. And that would be great, but it's also illegal.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, unfortunately.
And I don't want to base my whole falconry on doing something illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Even I don't know who would get too upset about me killing a horned lark, but it's not something I want to do.
Right.
And that would be, aesthetically, that would be a really cool Merlin flight to watch. But watching them, smashing into a starling in a pig lot, that just doesn't trip my trigger.
Yeah, there's nothing like thinking about, how much of a privilege we have doing this sport of kings as you're wading through a bunch of cow and pig manure and stuff.
Yeah. I've had enough time with the big long wings where they checked the pigeons, caught a pigeon in a cattle lot or yard. We don't have many outdoor hogs anymore, but in my early days, sometimes that's where the pigeons where there's livestock being fed outdoors. And yeah, that's just no fun.
Yeah.
It's a good way to meet angry farmers too. And I'd rather meet happy farmers on better terms than I'm here. I want to walk through your pens.
Yeah. I'm sure. Well, trials and tribulations, we can't ever talk about those enough. And, that's just one of the many things that we have to deal with, unfortunately, with these birds sometimes. If you're ever in a position to, all the micro stuff is definitely fun. It's that much more gut wrenching whenever stuff goes bad, unfortunately, because, unfortunately, like, especially with like kestrels and some of these other smaller birds, they get to be such like house furniture and almost become part of like your natural like home aesthetic. And you almost can't help in some ways get just a little bit more broken up when something bad happens to them on occasion. But, there's nothing worse than, sitting and almost watching like your bird getting eaten by a coop or whatever, and stuff like that. It sucks, but, I'm sure you probably wasn't much different whenever you had your Merlin get eaten by a red tail or whatever too. And I don't know for sure what got it, but I tracked down the partially, the eaten corpse and feather pile and before we go down on that somber note, we'll go ahead and well, before we start to wrap this up, and as you've heard earlier, I like to get at least one or two good hunting stories or experiences with a particular bird and a piece of advice and stuff before I wrap things up. But if you don't mind sharing, a good hunting memory or experience or whatever, just go ahead and start with that. And
one of the most dynamic birds I flew was my first longwing. It was a passage prairie falcon that had been trapped. Tom Deckert and Lance Christensen were out in Kansas and trapped it. And after my Harris hawk that I'd had for several years got killed, I ended up taking that bird. And it would hit things so hard. It only weighed 25 ounces, but it would hit a pheasant and sometimes just powder it, where it just, explosion of feathers, and the pheasant would drop to the ground limp, or it would drop to the ground and be doing the death flutter when it hit the ground, where it's just like, a chicken with its head cut off, where the pheasant's flipping and rolling because its brain got smashed in the strike. And, a couple of those hits were really dramatic. One in particular when my son was with me and we were hunting near a small gravel pit, and we flushed the pheasant and it flew out to the west at sunset, and it was flying right into the sun, and all of a sudden the prairie falcon flew right through it, and there was just this big dazzling explosion of feathers twinkling in the sun over the snow background. And this, it was pretty spectacular. Even my son got excited, and he was hard to get excited about falconry, but he still, will talk about that hit because it was so dramatic. There must have been a cloud of feathers about 20 feet in diameter in the air, and then that pheasant hit the ground just stone dead. And she just you could tell when she knew she hit him hard enough to kill him that she'd make no real effort to get back quickly. She'd just turn around and go, land on them, where if they weren't going to be dead when they hit the ground, she'd do a really tight pitch up and a quick whip around and, try to grab them on the ground really quick. And compared to peregrines, prairie falcons are almost like a Cooper's hawk on the ground, that they'll, sometimes I pulled her out of badger holes or inside rolls of fence where she'd caught the pheasant after she'd hit it initially, and then chased it down into cover that you'd never think of a long wing going into. Sure.
Yeah. Prairies are fun, man. Hopefully we'll get to try that again someday, but yeah, so, well, I mean, that's funny. I hope to eventually, I mean, I have seen some falcons, of course, catch game in person and everything, but I'm still waiting to get a chance to see that really cool stoop, and then that smack. And, I haven't really seen a catch yet where, the game's just got hit so hard that all you see is just a poof of feathers or whatever, and hit that, that baseball bat sounding, thunk. And I'm sure it'll happen someday, but that's cool.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that keeps you coming back. And, the first time my first goshawk, caught a pheasant off the fist, and it flew out about 75 yards. And you're like, why is it flying so low? Because it was flying right along the ground, and the pheasant was up in the air. And all of a sudden the goshawk went straight up from underneath it. And 1 second the hawk was underneath, and the next second, the hawk was on top and the pheasant was dangling from the hawk.
Yeah, those, what do they call those things? The swoop and scoops or whatever. Yeah. No, that's cool. Yeah, well, I think, so I think that pretty much what's left is, a piece of advice that you might have to pass on. Then we can call this good, probably, bud.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is try to figure out what you've got for quarry, match the bird to the quarry, and enjoy them. They're all wonderful. Just because it's more expensive or more rare doesn't make it a better bird. So, having the coolest, neatest hawk means nothing if you aren't out there hawking game with it, in my mind. That's your thing, I guess. That's your thing, but maybe stick to parrots, in my mind, and not just have a majestic bird of prey that's simply a lawn ornament and something you parade around town to get people watching. But get out there and hunt whatever you can.
Yeah, well, it's like a friend of mine used to say quite often. It's like if red tails were harder to get, like everybody would want one. That kind of mentality. If it wasn't. And then, the strike we were talking about with falcons, that's the normal thing for red tails, only it's on the ground. They'll thud into the ground like an anvil dropped out of the tree. It's just, I don't know how they don't break themselves more often than they do. I've seen one or two get well, one definitely got dazed pretty good. I've seen one kill itself before on impact on the ground doing that. Yeah, I mean, it happens. Yeah. So. But anyway, well, is there anything else you want to discuss that we didn't cover or anything? Or you?
No, I think that's good. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, thanks for, like I said, thanks for making the drive out and hanging for a little bit today, and for doing it. I mean, hopefully it was slightly more convenient for you than eventually having to drive, 3 to 4 hours or whatever tomorrow or however long it'll be for you.
And that would have been no big deal, except I'm juggling family obligations and.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I think it worked out better, even though it was a longer drive for me today, doing this, going ahead and getting you and Lance, recorded on this Friday, and and whenever you guys aren't going to have to juggle everything that you're going to have to juggle tomorrow and stuff too, or at least, as far as he goes with getting the birds ready and everything, it worked out better anyway. So, but thanks again, Ross, and hopefully, maybe like we discussed earlier, when next time I come out here again, maybe over the course of the season when making a hunt or something, maybe we can do a group one and have some fun, talking about some different stuff in another round table or something like that. So
yeah, that sounds like a good time.
Yeah, it'd be fun. There'll be some beer involved at that point.
Yeah, no, that's good. Beer, food.
Yeah. Well, like I said,
maybe we can actually get some hawking in.
Yeah. No, I mean, hopefully it would be a celebratory one in some regard too. Having some good flights and game in the bag, and hopefully we'll do this again then. So.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, thanks, Ross.
All right, thanks, John.